Welcome to the Behaviour Speak podcast. Now, here's your host, Ben Ryman.
Welcome to another episode of the Behaviour Speak podcast. As always, I'm your host, Ben Ryman. On the podcast today, we're down in the Caribbean, talking to folks from a few different places, which is going to be fun. We've got Sloane Pharr, Gabi Torres, and Kim Woolery on the show today. Welcome to the podcast, everyone.
Hi, Ben.
Hi.
Thank you.
Awesome. Well, before I get started, I just want to acknowledge that I'm producing and hosting this podcast on the territory of the Tla'amin, Halmoko, Klehus, and Comox First Nations, who were one nation before we settler colonizers came in and split them off into the so-called Indian reserves. I'm living here on unceded land, and certainly grateful to be able to do this here. So today, like I said, we're talking about the Caribbean.
I just wanted to take the time to thank you for acknowledging that about First Nations land. I think it's really important. I've heard you say that before on the podcast, and I know that that's a huge hot topic. Well, not hot topic, but I just think it's important that you acknowledge that. And I appreciate that you acknowledge that every podcast as well.
Yeah, I just went to, and I'll even share it in the show notes, because I know Territorial Acknowledgements is not just something we do sort of in my neck of the woods, but there's certainly Indigenous peoples all over the world and who have been affected by colonization, and I think Territorial Acknowledgements do play a role in a lot of the communities. And I just went to a webinar, which I'll share the link to. It's on YouTube, by a fellow named Len Pierre, who I've mentioned before as well. He's an Indigenous consultant that my company CBI has been contracted with to kind of work on truth and reconciliation type issues, which the term kind of comes from. Well, I'll talk about that another time. But he did a really nice sort of explanation of sort of territorial acknowledgements, kind of how you do them and how they're perceived, and sort of the different sort of kind of levels of territorial acknowledgements. Could have he's created a sort of three stages. The one I just did today was kind of called the standard territorial acknowledgement, where you just kind of acknowledge the names of the lands and acknowledge that you're a settler or a colonist or whatnot, and then they kind of get more and more expansive as depending on the context, and sort of just depending on kind of, I guess, sort of spiritually kind of where you are and kind of what your gut instinct is telling you. And I think I've done sort of all three levels throughout, but it was a bit what's the term I'm looking for? I don't know, it was a bit of a relief, I guess, when Len said, I didn't have to do sort of a level 3 acknowledgement every single time I did one. And if you listen to sort of consecutive episodes, you'll notice that some of them are quite similar. Some of them, there's really no difference, and because I haven't really done enough research and work to sort of have more ideas to share. And he said, so it's perfectly fine to do standard ones, especially in sort of repeated type contexts. But the other side of the coin is they really talk about doing, more in-depth ones whenever you do meetings sort of with people sort of outside of your organization. And so the podcast is sort of unique in that way, since it's always people outside of the organization. So I'll still have to do some reflection kind of on that and kind of see how it goes. But it's definitely it's something new I've been doing it, and it's something that I upon sort of some research that isn't normally done on podcasts. So I'm hoping, I think there are some Indigenous podcasts that sort of do them themselves, but I'm hoping that this will sort of maybe encourage other folks who maybe host a podcast to think about doing the same.
I hope so too.
Yeah. Yeah. To get started, we'll maybe get started with some introductions, kind of in terms of sort of where you are. Number one, I think, is important, and then sort of how you kind of got into the field of ABA, and kind of how that led up to the kind of work you're doing now. And Sloane, why don't you go first?
Thank you, Ben. Thank you for this opportunity. I am in the Cayman Islands, but I trained in the US with another one of our participants, Gabi. I have been in Cayman since 2010, and I was working to start the first ABA services in the Cayman Islands, and I jumped on it, and it's been a really exciting venture. However many years down the line now, ABA at that time was still in its infancy. And since then, there's been quite an explosion in the Cayman Islands. But it really did start off small and, built over time to be a priority of mine. Over the years, we've trained 17 individuals to become RBTs, and 13 of them are Caymanians, which is something that I'm really dedicated to, because that's a sustainable situation where you're not bringing individuals in to provide services and then there's discontinuity when they leave. And so I've been very dedicated to developing a quality career path that is sustainable for the Cayman Islands. The Wellness Center is the private wellness provider that I work for, and we have a clinical side as well as an ABA side. Recently, we've opened an adult skills center as well, so we service individuals from 18 months to 30 plus, and now we're starting a behavioral gerontology center really as well. Cool. So we're really looking forward to just servicing anyone and everyone in the Cayman Islands. There's some barriers, which I think Gabi and Kim also. Thankfully, we were able to successfully advocate for that in 2011, which opened a lot of doors.
Gabrielle, tell me about yourself. Where are you from, and where you're working, and kind of your story of getting into the field.
Sure. So I am originally from the island of Curacao. I do live in the U.S. now. I went to graduate school with Sloane, so I moved here for college. Was on my way to med school and read an email from a parent looking for a therapist for their home-based services for their child. And that threw my life completely upside down. And I went into the field of behavior analysis, worked there, went to grad school, met Sloane, continued working in the U.S. I owned and operated my own clinic here in the U.S. for 10 years. And would frequently go home. I mean, my whole family is in Curacao, so Curacao and then the island next to it, Aruba. That's where my family is. And so I would, as an American company, had made its way to Curacao to consult and provide services, but it was the model you were describing: train the direct providers, but the behavior analyst is flying in and leaving. I guess word got out that I was a behavior analyst, and people started connecting with me and saying like, hey, we hear you're doing all these great things in the US. When are you going to help your own people? And that's when I started kind of looking at what we could do on the island that was focused on capacity building, so that when funds ran out, when someone decided they no longer wanted to travel to our islands, how could we still keep services going? Because there really was nothing. We are, or at least we were back then, under this model of like, oh, these types of people, right, like need to go into residential care, and that's all there is, like just day programs, residential care, no skills. Kind of, so we were setting, I think, limits for people. And so the groups that had kind of been exposed to ABA wanted more. There are parents who leave the island to go to the US, to other countries to seek services, right? And so we started thinking about what can we do locally. And so in 2017, I started a foundation there with parents, some of the people who had been trained as, they never got their RBT because they didn't fly up to the US to take the tests, but they were trained basically to that level of direct service providing. And we started a foundation, and our goal became awareness. So we've now been running that center for 4 years. And the my main goal, so I started a lot as kind of clinical advising, and I was that, even though I'm from Curacao, I live in the US, so I was that external BCBA. And so my goal became, what is the training going to look like? We ran into a little bit of a hiccup when the BACB stopped with the international credential, and that shifted us. But I'm now in the process of training 6 people to become IBTs, International Behavior Therapists, and then 2 are working towards their IBA, their International Behavior Analyst.
Cool.
And I'm really excited, yes, because that then allows them to continue, right? Now, once those IBAs are trained, they can keep training more people. Some of the people who are in the IBT training right now are already looking forward to that next step of becoming behavior analysts. And so we're really excited. And like Sloane, like just going on that path to like find funding, make things affordable. I've been working with the schools, so doing a lot of advocacy and kind of trying to change policy so that the schools will open up to us coming in as behavior analysts. And so it's where I've dedicated most of my work now. I do here in the US, I'm doing mentoring and coaching and some consulting for new BCBAs, clinical leaders, clinic owners. And then I spend a lot of time in Curacao and also in other parts of the Caribbean, providing that mentorship of, okay, there's nothing. How do we who do you talk to? How do you leverage what we know? And just building those career paths so that it could be sustainable back home and on other islands. So
really cool. I got a lot of questions, but I want to get the last introductions done because they really apply to everybody. So Kimberly, I know you're in a bit of a different. There is a lack of diversity when it comes to educational material depicting Black children in the field of applied behavior analysis. Human Expressions gives Black and brown children realistic and detailed images of kids who look like them, modeling everyday skills that may be difficult for them to communicate or express. At Human Expressions, the benefits of representation for Black and brown kids in educational curricula are clear. Increased self-esteem, reducing stereotypes, and increased validation and support. To learn more, go to www.humanexpressions.org. That's human, HUEMAN, expressions.org. If you're planning on collecting continuing education credits for this episode, you'll need to enter the 3 secret words at www.cbiconsultants.com/shop. The first secret word is compassion. Situation than the other 2. So let's just hear your sort of where you're from, but also where you're working, and kind of a little bit about sort of kind of ABA in that area.
Sure. So I was born and raised in Kingston, Jamaica, and I'm still in Kingston, Jamaica. I do go back and forth between Florida right now. I'm physically in Florida. In terms of getting into the field of behavior analysis, that was not my end goal at all, or my end game, so to speak. And as I heard Sloane talking about gerontology, it kind of fits into a little bit about my story. So my goal was to become a marriage and family therapist. But when I had graduated from FIU, my dad got very sick. And so I made the decision to move back to Jamaica full time to support, my parents. And so it was kind of like the graduate school I had applied to be like, well, you have to be on site to do this program. I'm like, well, dementia and other health issues. So I was like, well, what are my options? Like, well, you could do behavior analysis. I'm like, okay, what does that mean? They're like, you can work with children with special needs. And I was like, okay, that's all cool. I tell people I fell into ABA due to the situation I was put in, and I don't regret it. I enjoy the field. But because at the time there were no behavior analysts on the island, I had to seek out remote supervision. There was also no centers on the island. So my training experience was through like an occupational therapist who unfortunately she closed down her clinic, and I was being supervised, I think, by 4 different people. And then that kind of spun off into my frustrations with trying to deliver services on the island because unfortunately we do not have insurance reimbursing any services. And it's still more or less the same. All services are private pay. And then again, we have a huge economic disparity because I can't remember what our GDP is, but I'll give you an example. Like $1 is equal to 150 Jamaican dollars. So if you try and translate the American model or Western model to the Jamaican dollar and what people are earning, it doesn't apply to, I would say, let's call it 90% of the population. And I'm throwing out statistics here. And I had a lot of challenges even having parents being open to services, being open to me providing services, even though I was being supervised. Some parents, there's a lot of stigma against mental illness. I think we are moving towards the right direction in the sense that in terms as adults, and I would call it like my generation, we're more open about mental health, we're more open about seeking help. But in terms of autism, there's some kind of stigma, and I would have parents who did not want to use the word or the diagnosis. They would not want, if I was to run a program and record myself working, they did not want me to run a new program so that their child would not appear, so to speak, they didn't want their child to appear like they were not as intellectually savvy as a typical child. So it was, again, lots of challenges. Even just getting hours, 10 hours was not feasible. The most I've ever seen is maybe 6 hours, and even then, to US dollars an hour, that is expensive for a lot of parents. So again, it's only applicable or available to really, I would say, like maybe 2% of the population, which again, it can be very challenging. But in terms of what I'm doing now, I kind of fell into the telehealth world because I had a lot of personal challenges delivering services on the island. And again, just having those doors open. I know Cayman has a little different situation. Jamaica, as I said, we have our economic challenges in that, the one country, we just have our challenges and lots of disparity. So again, segue to again, because I was caring for my dad, and so that's what I do now. I currently provide telehealth services for various companies. One is IBAO Squad, and another one is this is more a data collection software company called Motivity. And but then this my frustration turned into me deciding that I was going to write this blog for special learning at the time, creative in terms of gaining hours, because there wasn't enough face-to-face time. So I was working with special learning. I wrote this blog about the barriers in delivering behavior analytics services in the island. And my supervisor at the time encouraged me to submit the paper to ABAI, and it was accepted. And then I started to realize that even if I'm not providing services physically on the island, I can disseminate best practice and do research and tell people, or rather show people, how you can provide culture responsive services, how can you provide services for the diaspora, because of course Gabi is part of the diaspora from Curacao. I am part of the Jamaican diaspora, in Florida, and I have encountered a lot of families that are from the diaspora. So from that, you need to lead from a culturally sensitive lens, and also just learning how to meet people where they are, and knowing that one size does not fit all. I know you've had a lot of people talk about culture responsive services on this podcast before, but for me, my interest is disseminating best practices, conducting research, and hopefully submitting things into journals, webinars as well. So the way I feel that I am doing my part is by disseminating information and kind of like trying to educate, I guess, the general BACB, because again, Florida has a history of condos. So how do we, again, meet people where they are, and again, not necessarily putting an agenda, because obviously we want all kids to succeed, but there's some people that are from multi-generational homes. Some people, again, I came across another, it was a caregiver, but the grandmother didn't know that the child had a diagnosis, a formal diagnosis. So it's again just learning to be culturally sensitive. So I guess that is my background.
Yeah, no, for sure. Cool. And I think I can certainly relate to the dissemination sort of piece of your role. I mean, I'm the same. I don't even work with cases anymore. I just disseminating is sort of a big part of my job now too, and I love it. So I definitely I think we need we need people in all these kind of aspects. So, but also I know.
Oh, for sure.
I know. I went to your the recent webinar you did with Baba on telehealth, and
yes.
Which was awesome. I mean, you definitely know your stuff, and there's a lot to
Thank you.
Yeah, there's a lot to telehealth that I think folks don't realize. I mean, I think there was a lot of folks kind of asking lots of questions about telehealth when kind of COVID hit, but telehealth was happening long before COVID,
right?
And will continue to happen sort of long after, and so I think not only providing telehealth services is really important, but helping people understand, how to do all the things we've been talking about a lot on the podcast through telehealth. It's not the same as doing it in person.
No, it's not the same at all. It definitely has a different set of skill sets, but I think also one thing with doing telehealth, it has allowed me to work with so many people across the United States, so many different subcultures. The West is very different from the Midwest, which is very different from the East. So, and then again, you get a whole conglomerate of different cultures and people who are like first generation, and their children, are born here, or maybe they were brought over here to, again, seek services, which is typically what I see a lot of folks. Maybe they move to Canada to try and stay the home country because either it's not available or the providers there are just booked or it's too expensive. So I find a lot of people tend to migrate for that purpose, for that stability and and for insurance coverage. But as you said, telehealth is very, very different, but I find it very rewarding.
So that kind of leads me to another question I was thinking about, both kind of related to migrating and also related to your comment on kind of working with the diaspora. I'm curious if and this question is kind of for both Gabrielle and Kimberly. I think less so for Sloane because you're now kind of working primarily in the Caymans, with Cayman folks, whereas Gabrielle and Kimberly are often out of town. Do you find that you're primarily working with kind of the Jamaican diaspora? Do you find that you're kind of working with the Curacao diaspora, so to speak, or are you sort of kind of across the board? And then kind of related to that question, I'm also just wondering about the migration piece. Do you find that there are people in some of the other islands where there maybe aren't behavior analysts or there isn't the infrastructure for behavior analysis? Do you find there is a lot of migration from these islands sort of to the places where you're now kind of providing services?
Okay, so in my experience, particularly in South Florida, I have seen a huge Jamaican. I have had a lot of Jamaican families from other islands like St. Kitts, from Trinidad, a lot of people from Haiti, sometimes even Puerto Rico. Even Puerto Rico is now establishing, they do have insurance coverage, but a lot of families from Puerto Rico. So I do find there's a huge, a lot of Caribbean or Latin American and Caribbean families that they either migrate for, again, securing better health services or to get their child services. So I know a family in particular, not one that I treat, that they moved solely to get their son services and into the system. And I know another family that they're looking to also move, again, solely to get their son into the system because they are frustrated with the current situation in Jamaica, unfortunately. So I will say that a huge percent, and I really expand this, I know that the wealth of will come up here to receive like very, intensive surgery if they can afford it. Like if they have something like there's unfortunately a distrust in the healthcare field and the medical fraternity. So, and I don't know if that is due to religious purposes or because we have a lack of resources or because we're spread too thin. That a lot of people, that's generally the consensus because, Jamaica is an hour and 27 minutes away from Miami. That's an hour and 27-minute flight. So they'll go forth like I do frequently, where they'll go and they'll have their child receiving services. They go home for the holidays or they go home for, a couple of breaks, and then they have them steadily in therapy. And again, because again, and it's easier for them to either secure a job out here. Maybe it's not what they want to do, but secure a job that will get them benefits, or that they can provide, get services for their children. But I would say the majority comes from a lot of different islands. I've seen it even from like, from Pakistan, India, in Asia as well. I've had lots of families as well, but the Caribbean type of families, mostly in South Florida, I would say, not so much in the other states. So if you're more in the East, I'm more likely to come up for birth.
Gabrielle, do you want to jump in?
But yes, so Curacao is a very small island, and we are an old Dutch colony. So most of the people will move from Curacao to the Netherlands to get like a better life or more services. And initially, kind of ABA was not as well known there. So I think I, living in the US, have not ever worked with anyone from Curacao. I do when I was running my company. We had Spanish language services, and I always had providers who spoke other languages as well. We had Mandarin and Tamil. And so our clients, when I lived in the diverse area, we always had clients from often first generation immigrants who had their kids in the US and were coming to us. And I don't know if that was because they read my bio, because we were just pulling towards each other. But that was the work that I was doing here in the US. And then I think now in Curacao, what we've actually seen is I just recently had a call with someone. She's from Curacao, had moved to the US, and is alone and is looking for her, right, being close to family. If you have children, I have 2 kids of my own, like that's the one thing I miss. I'm far from my community, from my family. And so she had heard about us, and now she's considering moving back home because there's finally an option where she doesn't have to stay in the US to get services for her son. She can actually potentially go back home, be close to family, and get services. And so that's something that was really cool to kind of experience, that like, wow, we're making it so people don't have to leave. And so it really encourages us to continue working. And then I've started doing some mentoring of different people on different islands in the Caribbean. And I have seen what you mentioned, right? Like, are people moving to different islands? So I know some people from other islands actually come to the Cayman Islands. So to me, Cayman it's like the furthest ahead out of all of the Caribbean. And so people are moving there, get training. And now with telehealth, basically so Sloane and I are part of the, this is kind of connecting people in the Caribbean together. I've started getting requests to do some of that, like telehealth mentoring. And I actually mentor someone who's on one island as she's providing services on other islands, because she goes back and forth to different islands providing support. And so we're kind of looking at this network of right, do what we can right now, and that is telehealth, and that is supporting, and then encourage people to start things. And I think, Kimberly, what you're doing, right? Like, I can actually point and say, look, someone from Jamaica, someone from an island just like us is out there doing big things, getting research out that is more appropriate for us. Because we couldn't, what we have in Curacao, if I explain it, it's not at all what you see here in the US. It's not one-to-one. It's just not affordable. And so we are adjusting and adapting, and just what can we offer that is high quality, but affordable, or at least more affordable. And just really, my goal is that no one really, right, if you want to move to get a street, the fact that you have to uproot your whole family and move to another country, take a job that isn't necessarily what you studied or what you want to do, just so that your child can get services. That's like my long-term goal, to like not have to have people do that, because it also puts a huge equity gap. Like, not everyone can pick up and move. And so those people are not getting services for their kids, and those kids are staying home because in Curacao, at least, like, school, they don't know how to create a space where kids, with a diagnosis can be successful. So lots of things. I'm on a mission here. So if you let me, I'll talk your ear off about all the things I want to achieve.
The thing I also try to go into school, the echoing response that I get from lots of parents in Jamaica is going to accommodate their child, or their child will get removed from the school, or their child will get kicked out of the school, or they don't have the accommodation. So I even attempted going to various schools across the island, offering like, hey, I can create, this support system for, these children. They're like, well, Kimberly, only one person. We would love to come, but we don't have the resources and we don't have the funding to do that. And as Gabi said, to be very honest, it can be very traumatizing because you don't have that, support system. And that's, I think, one of the hardest things for me, even when I was up here for for school, just not having that support system, even though I have a lot of siblings in South Florida and I have a lot of family, it just wasn't the same type of support system that you have at home. And then you miss that. And I think that the challenge is that having your support system, but then also getting the services that you need. So you're isolated. So then I think that puts a lot of strain on, first generation parents, because they're there by themselves. They're doing the best for their child. But again, that you're ripping away that support system that you have and that community support, because it's very community oriented. I mean, in Jamaica, we'll call, like, if I was to have known Gabi's parents, I'd call them auntie or uncle. That's just one of the cultural norms. So even though you're not, physically blood related to someone, you call them auntie or uncle. That's just how it is. It's not to someone if your parent has to work late, or it's a different communal type of system. So it's very unfortunate because it is hard. And I know that as you said, they pick up and they have to take a job that they did not necessarily study for, because their priority is their child. And then there comes with sometimes there's the cultural dissonance, which is what I say, that when you are in somewhere that it's not your home country and you're trying to adapt norms and values, and then you're also trying to adapt to what is present, because it's not really, being honest, behavior analysis is not really set up for diverse individuals. We're having a movement now, but it's really not designed for a typical Caribbean family or a typical Jamaican family or a family from Curacao, because as Gabi said, the Cayman, I think, is miles and miles and miles ahead of us. And I think that has a lot to do with I'm not sure if it's just tourism or if it's like them earning US dollars and then not having that wealth and equity as well. So I will that, like, I think even in Turks and Caicos, they still struggle with getting services as well. They can get services, but they still want to come over. And that's been experiences that I've heard verbatim from other families. So, and again, this is all boils down, like, I know you mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, colonialism. Unfortunately, these are the remnants of colonialism on an island. People came in and they invaded, and unfortunately, they ransacked us, sorry for a better word. And then so now we're kind of left to pick up the pieces. And when you're predominantly Black country or predominantly, darker skin, I think Gabi mentioned this too, that Curacao is a predominantly Black country as well, or people of Afro descent. I do think there is that disparity as well. So then there is the dissonance, moving to the United States, moving somewhere else where you're not comfortable, you don't have your support system. And as I said, Jamaica is still reeling from post-colonial effects, which is very relevant to the past 7 years this year. And we were colonized by Spain and England. I know Curacao, from I remember learning about it, it's the ABC Islands, so they speak Dutch there. But we speak English in Jamaica, obviously. But again, so there's also that portion too with the colonialism. And sometimes there's a little bit of hesitancy to even being open to the medical model, because we tend to rely a lot on religion. Not everyone, but we tend to rely on a lot of religion. So that can also be a barrier as well. In again, I would say across some communities. So it's a.
So I'm wondering. That's really interesting. I want to talk just a little bit about sort of, and you've kind of already started to touch on this quite a bit, Kimberly, but the kind of the history and sort of demographics of the places you're from. I know you can't speak to sort of every Caribbean island, but a lot of folks, myself included, up until maybe a few years ago, sort of looked at the Caribbean as essentially just a bunch of tourist islands.
So
a bunch of islands full of resorts with beaches and bikinis and the whole sort of sort of tourism kind of image. And then maybe folks would know a little bit about Haiti as being sort of this place with a lot of problems, because Haiti seems to make the news solely for sort of earthquakes and unrest and nothing else. And then the rest of the islands, again, they're all just sort of they're all I think for a lot of folks sort of outside of the Caribbean, they're all the same. they're all just one set of islands, all these sorts of things. Some folks may have some idea when they hear British Virgin Islands. Okay, well, maybe that one's different because there's the word British in it. But generally, there's this sort of presumption, or Jamaica, because Bob Marley was popular, they've sort of have some images there of sort of, I'm sure you know what those images are, and that's sort of about it. But obviously there's a lot more to these places. So I'm curious, sort of one, kind of about the history, because like we touched a bit on sort of Indigenous peoples in the beginning of the podcast, so kind of a multi-part question here, which you can sort of answer any parts you want. I'm curious sort of about the history of the islands in terms of the different peoples that kind of those that lived there originally, sort of pre-colonization. Are they still around? Or were they decimated or whatnot? And two, kind of who's there now and kind of how they ended up there. A bit of kind of that backstory.
Sorry, I was going to say, interestingly enough, Haiti was the first world's Black-led republic, and the first actually independent Caribbean island that kind of dismantled colonialism. So it's very sad to see that this has come at a crippling cost to them, because they've had to pay reparations. But in terms of the history of Jamaica was populated by Indigenous people. There are the Tainos. I have the Taino population. They're a small population. I believe, if I remember correctly, the Arak population was decimated by the Spanish when they came in 1655 and colonized us. And then they kind of, as I said, plundered all of our resources. And if you watch Pirates of the Caribbean and you see Port Royal, that is, again, it was the hub for a lot of exports and exporting to, the Spanish Queen and stuff like that. So, Jamaica, there's lots of places in Jamaica. A place in Jamaica that's called Spanish Town, which it used to be called, I can't remember the name, but it was considered, if you will, it would call the, and in sometime in 1655, the British invaded and they kind of took over. And then that lasted until 1962. And so Jamaica's actually now trying to kind of separate themselves from the crown, because the queen is kind of still our queen. We still have like a governor general that responds to the queen, reports to the queen rather, even though it's not the queen, now it's the king. We've been, because slaves or, people of African descent, they were, they're trying to, fight oppression, and there's a lot of civil unrest and there's lots of activism. Then they actually brought in and I don't love using this, in China and East India. So then we have a lot of influences. So which is where the curry comes in, which is where we have like amazing Jamaican Chinese food. And also we have a lot of Jewish people that fled as well, and they were merchants and they fled for persecution. So Jamaica's kind of always been sort of a place that people tend to of so many different ethnicities, so many different places. And even though our motto is out of many one people, and I would say the population is primarily of Afro descent, the people that are in charge of the tend to be more brown skinned or lighter skinned, or what I call, they benefited from the plantocracy system, which means that they came there as settlers, or they came there because they wanted to whatever back in the day, and then they just ended up monopolizing the wealth in the country, which again leads to wealth inequity. And I mean, I don't want to turn this into like a history lesson, but that's kind of what happens, unfortunately. So there are, again, when we're looking at the wealth inequity, people of Afro descent, that is not to say that they cannot, be successful. It's not to say that they're unable to make a living for themselves, but there is a lot of classism, and there is racism to a lesser extent, but I would say classism in Jamaica as well, which also prevents, children, predominantly children, which is just the unfortunate state. There's also lots of classism where, even someone like myself, I might move in different circles and they may be like, oh, but I don't know who you are. And then so I am seen as less qualified sometimes. I'm less qualified, again, because I display me to come into the Jamaican scenario where it may be dominated by people of fair skin tone or of again, so the people that are somewhat trusted, again, across this demographic. I may not be the person that wants this. So again, through this frustration, I turned it into research. So again, because the people who hold the wealth are the people that are in charge, and again, because of classism, that is another barrier as well for disseminating, I guess, even providing services. It's just something, again, that's embedded from colonialism, with even, and I don't even like to use this word, with mixing or even forced mixing and stuff like that. So there's a lot of things that may affect, my ability to probably provide services. I'm not saying it was, and I know Gabi had mentioned this earlier when we had first met, that she does find that families are more likely to listen to her because she is, again, of a lighter skin tone, lighter, but it's just something that I have found fascinating and change it. And Gabi, if you want to jump in on colorism, which is where I'm piggybacking off of.
Yes, I am. As you were talking, Kimberly, I think our islands have similar histories, other colonializers, but similar histories in terms of kind of where we've gone. And so Curacao, we had there is hardly anyone from kind of that Native American descent left in Curacao. And I went to kind of look, and it was actually when the Spanish settled us first, they actually shipped everyone off to be slaves on other islands. The Curacao and as other parts of the Caribbean, the great thing is we're protected from hurricanes. In terms of being a colony, we were not as useful to the Spanish as they thought we would be because we didn't have fertile soil. And so they had colonized us, but after, and they took advantage of our harbor. So we have a very, very deep harbor that allowed ships to safely enter, and they could close off the harbor. And so it kept ships safe. And so the Dutch converted Curacao into like their main trade center on this side of the world. And that trade was, yes, great. So we became slaves in Arabia, which meant that people were coming mostly from Western Africa, being brought over and then being resold to other islands. And so our population now is 85% Black, or at least most of us are mixed. So I am very white looking. I took after my Dutch grandmother, but I'm mixed race, mix of like Venezuelan and African descent, and some Eastern and Western European mixed in there. And that's pretty much the population of Curacao, is that many of us are mixed. There is a combination of Dutch people who came because we are still part of the Dutch kingdom. So we were part of a 5-island nation for a very long time, Bonaire and Curacao, and then Saba, St. Martin, and Saint Eustatius. And in 2010, we became an independent country, but we are still part of the Dutch kingdom. And so I think it has its benefits because, as you said, right, what people know about the Caribbean is it's these beautiful tropical islands. And so the Dutch, they do kind of take care of some of the things on the island because it is their vacation getaway. But behind those vacation resorts, there are a lot of people that live there. There's a whole population of people that live there, and tourism is one of our big industries. We also had an oil refinery because we are really close to the coast of Venezuela. So the Dutch found oil in South America and used our island as a refinery site. And then we had a free zone like trading place. So we have a lot of, just like in Jamaica, we have a lot of Jewish people that came from Portugal, but also from Brazil. And then over time, we've also had Chinese and Indian immigrants. Our local language is called Papiamento, and it's actually an Afro-Portuguese Creole that has a whole bunch of languages mixed into it, because that's how the merchants and people trading communicated with each other. So in Curacao, we speak 4 languages. Dutch is our main like school language, and then Papiamento has evolved over time to an official language. And then we're close to South America, so we speak Spanish. And then we have all tourists coming in because we're close to the US, so we also speak English. But it's and in 5th grade, I think, and then 5th grade. So you're learning all the languages so that you can be ready to talk to tourists. So In terms of, I think we definitely still have the classes that stand by. It's a little less, I don't know, I can't decide if it's the color of my skin or the fact that I went to the US to study, right? And so like America, like I got to go there. Probably a little bit of both. And so I will use that. I'll just stand there and be the person to be like, use my name, put it next to your name if it helps make you sound more credible. And when I was growing up, it was a woman. And so it always baffles me when right, living in the US, it's such a big deal that we've only, for the longest time, there were only white male presidents. And I grew up with a Black female prime minister. And so I think that is one thing that I've noticed in Curacao. While we are still governed, right, in part by the Dutch Kingdom, we do have most of the people in our government are mixed race, Black, white. It's a mix. You get a little bit of like, oh, you're not from Curacao. Like people will sometimes see me and go like, oh, she's Dutch. And then when I speak the local language, you're like, oh no, she is from here. And so there are those cultural things where kind of you're either a local or you're not. And in terms of culture and community, you get kind of shut out if you're not from the island. But in terms of bringing in services, it is like, oh, wow, you studied in the US. Oh, wow, you went and did something big in another country. And then we're going to listen to you versus potentially there are some really wonderful people in Curacao who are really well trained. And so those are the people. I mean, the clinical director I work with in Curacao, she did not study. Well, no, I don't think she left to study outside of Curacao, but she's brilliant. I mean, she's the work she's doing down there. I started needing to have like trainer, and now she's just doing some amazing things down there. And I love seeing that because it shows people, and if you don't need to go and only count on like those experts from another country, like we can do it too. We can build up our own skills and take care of our own people. So it's definitely an interest in other country and learn that here in the US, for example, you didn't learn the same history. We had to learn so much. I learned about different islands. There are Dutch islands in the Caribbean, Spanish islands, there's French islands that are still, they're actual provinces of their countries. Yeah. While some of us are fully independent countries, others are countries, but we're part of the kingdoms. And so we still get like external governance happening. And so it's complicated initially when we thought about how do we get together, right? We're all small countries. How do we get together and support each other? Well, there are like 7, 8, I don't know how many different government styles that you have to figure out when you're figuring out what license, what credential would work here on the islands.
Oh, for sure.
What do people need? So, yeah.
I do think it's interesting that you mentioned that because, again, we've had a lot of mixed race prime ministers as well. We call them prime ministers, mixed race prime ministers, Black prime ministers, and Black people and mixed people in the government as well. And again, so the same thing. Like when you mentioned I don't want to butcher the word, but in Jamaica we speak patois, which is a mix of, it's English-based Creole, but it has West African influences and it's spoken in, Jamaica and the diaspora. And again, I think that comes from, again, having to interact with evil merchants or interact with slave owners, and then it became like a hodgepodge of languages. And then even if you were to listen to, we even have people from Ireland that have settled, and if you listen to the Irish accent and you listen to like a really deep, you'll hear, oh, that sounds exactly like how patois sounds. And even in Jamaica, there's different subcultures across different parts of the island. So even though we are a big tourist country, we even are a big tourist. Tourism is a big industry as well, but we exported bananas, we have Jamaican coffee, we have our rum and stuff like that. But I do think that people have this misconception that we're just a tourist island, when again, yes, it is, and it's more on the north coast and the west coast, the the western and the northern part of the island, and even the south. But we also have a thriving economy, thriving nightlife. Sorry, not economy. You can take that part out. But we do have a thriving culture, which is like we celebrate Carnival, lots of party scene, and rich music, which is not just like reggae music, and it's not just Bob Marley. There's so many other influences. So yeah, I do think like even when coming here, it was a shock to me too. It's a culture shock coming to the US to be like, oh, like where we have a lot of Black people, maybe in some leadership positions, and a lot of female people in leadership positions as well. So it is interesting to see the dynamics between the US and Jamaica, where because we're predominantly Black. So of course people in leadership positions or political positions would be of Black descent as well. So
moving over to Sloane here. So it sounds like, when we talked to him at the beginning and when we met kind of previously a month or so ago talking about all this, that the Caymans seemed to be kind of, ahead of the game, and Gabi and Kimberly have sort of attested to that as well. That sort of they're definitely certainly in terms of ABA services and whatnot. So a couple questions. One, sort of the same question, just as far as sort of the history, because Kimberly, you mentioned you don't want to make this into a history lesson, but I think we have to make this into a history lesson, because I think, especially hearing about all of the ridiculous things that are happening in Florida these days, no one's getting true history, right? So, and in fact, it's only recently now that I think more Americans are starting to, and Canadians and people around the world are starting to learn, what the real history was of the places we're living in, and it makes a difference. I mean, the governments have spent a lot of time trying to quash these facts and hide them and repress them and make everything sound like everything's been great forever. There was never racism and so on and so forth. So I think it's definitely important. So I'm curious about sort of the history in the Caymans, and also maybe how that kind of the history of the peoples and whatnot, and the sort of demographics, but also kind of how maybe that history is different or whatnot, that sort of has led to the Caymans being able to do more things in the Caymans in terms of ABA than some of these other islands.
I think the Cayman Islands are different in some aspects because of the fact that we are a financial hub, as well as do a lot of work currently, with overseas law firms, etc. So there's a lot of so-called wealth that does come through Cayman, but that was certainly not the case in the beginning. And the majority of Caymanians are of African, Welsh, Scottish, or English descent, and there's a lot of interracial mixing. We are a British overseas territory, and it is easy to draw some comparisons in terms of the fact that we do have a government that is locally voted in, and you can see a range of, quote, skin colors amongst the various. But as well, you do have a governor that has a post here from and is assigned by the king at this point. And initially, there was, the first permanent resident was noted around 1700, I believe, and there was also a time where the Cayman Islands did institute slavery. So historically, there are some similar lines to Curacao and to Jamaica, but obviously, there are some differences. And as it relates to ABA services, I guess the best I can say is there unfortunately is certainly especially now a haves and haves not situation going on, but I don't think that's only in Cayman. However, there's a huge expat community here, not solely funded by tourism in the least. Like I said, more so the reasons for that are financial in nature. But Caymanians, there is, in terms of the workforce, Caymanians are given priority, rightly so, for jobs and within the government especially. And that's the main source of insurance funding for services. And, I think that's a very lucky thing for the Cayman Islands. Both of you have spoken about the disparity in terms of wealth and that only the wealthy can afford services. But when we're talking about comprehensive ABA services, not just consultation to families, we're still talking about a significant amount of funds. Not even in Cayman is that accessible. And so there really is a push to try now to ensure that it's accessible across governments who have government insurance, as well as those who have the private insurance premiums that are technically more expensive, but provide much less. I'm not sure if that was a kind of a circular answer, but I was trying to bring it back a little bit more to ABA in the Caribbean, if that's okay. Yes, I think that, and as Gabi mentioned, both she and I are on the board of the Caribbean Association for Behaviour Analysis. And even though one of our goals is to help other countries set up regulatory bodies and licensing bodies, that each government is organized so differently and has links to different countries or overseas territories. It's a massive barrier, massive challenge in terms of moving that forward. And so you can talk about insurance, you can talk about haves and have-nots, you can talk about and who's going to be respected and whether that person has studied on island or off island. The barriers and the possibilities, I think, are, two sides of the coin, right? I try to consider my view a solution-focused kind of view, because I think that if we don't try while acknowledging the history, which is extremely important because it transcends generations. You cannot uproot a family, like Kim said, and still be as successful as you could to raise any child. And we are taking advantage that have additional stressors into a new country. And I think that overall, as we all try to navigate these murky waters of trying to undo or address what has happened in the past and move forward for the purposes of our discussion in terms of awareness, normalization of individuals with special needs, and not hiding people behind doors, and accepting help and accepting all versions of help, in terms of the person who's delivering the help. I think there's a lot of work to do, but I also think there's so many learnings that have already happened, both historically and currently. And there's so much work that still needs to go into it.
Sloane, I love what you said, because I think part of the success that Sloane has had on the Cayman Islands is that she did just go, yeah, here are all the obstacles and we're going to make stuff happen anyways. And so I do look at where she is and I go, okay, what can we learn, right? And I think other countries will do that too, because our governments are influenced by what other places are doing. And so I look and I go, what has she done? And I've asked, I'm working right now with trying to get the schools to accept our credentials and accept people who are trained, right? Because this is not a degree that exists in the Dutch system. That's a whole other conversation, but the Dutch system has all these layers of from high school on, of how many years you're in a certain program and what you can study, which is different from many of the kind of the traditional ABA master's programs. And so getting recognition for our degree has been something I've worked on. And so when the school says, we've heard of this ABA thing, we'd like to have resources, and she was able to share that. And so I think this is hard, right? You're a behavior analyst and you're an advocate and you're looking into policy. Our parents too, right? We work with a lot of parents who they're not just the parent of a child with special needs. They're their therapist. They're learning new things with funding sources, with government, with education, with schools. And so we're all just getting together and going, okay, these are our barriers. I mean, I can't tell you the number of times I've already written or knocked on doors or sat down with someone from the government to see what funding sources exist. And I just, at this point, early on, when we started the foundation, we went, okay, the center, we want to get that set up in like a year or two. Awareness, we're going to do immediately. Ensuring, we just kind of knew from the start, this was going to be a really long journey. And it was one where we were going to get a lot of no, and we still had to do it, right? This is what had to happen. And I'll tell you, there are times where they're exhausted because their child may be going through something, and then they're fighting this fight. And that's what's nice about being a community. We can go, okay, let me see what I can do, or someone else will reach out. Right now with this school thing, we've passed the baton of who's like the main point of contact multiple times, because first it was logistically, how could we bring people in? And then right now they're like questions about what it might actually look like. And I worked as a coach in schools here in the US. I'm like, let me model some stuff that I have. But it's a lot of no's. It's a lot of finding the one small opening, the window, the door that's open, and like sneaking your way in, and then turning to each other and asking, like, what have you done? And adjusting it for your own country. So I think seeing the success of the Cayman has been really inspirational to me, because it has shown me like it's possible. I mean, they have half the number of people that Curacao has, and like what, eight BCBAs total on island right now, Sloane. So
it varies, to be honest. Around there. There's actually one in the school system now, Gabi. So as you were talking about, long-term plans, I like to say, like, I did a presentation with the deputy principal of the only special needs school in Islands, governmental, and we talked through the last pretty much 13 years. And the first thing that we talked about, it was the ASD virtual symposium hosted by MICO University. So virtual symposium, and it was attended to wonderfully by about 250 participants, most of whom are living in the Caribbean, which was amazing. And
are you a solopreneur running your business alone and need help getting more exposure to your target audience while growing your brand? At BL Marketing Group, we specialize in delivering comprehensive marketing solutions tailored to your unique needs. Our team of seasoned experts excels in crafting creative strategies that captivate your target audience, build brand authority, generate high-quality leads, and streamline your business processes. Whether you're seeking a brand makeover, effective lead generation, or a plug-and-play solution that takes care of everything for you, we have you covered. Services can include strategy sessions, video editing, social media management, brand board development, and even a virtual assistant. When you choose BL Marketing Group, you're partnering with a team of passionate professionals who treat your business as our own. We go above and beyond to understand your goals, target audience, and unique challenges to craft tailor-made strategies that produce remarkable results. Schedule your free discovery call today at bmgfreeconsult.com. That's BMGFREE consult.com. The second secret word is community.
I heard a lot of learnings of families in significant distress, and people were on boards or started their own boards. But when it came to Cayman and this 13-year journey at this point, the first thing, there was a lot of no's, and that's okay with me. But the reality is that there needs to be a lot of humility when you're trying to get your agenda through. Humility, you have to be culturally aware, you have to be culturally sensitive. And those things like really do start to open the doors. And even as an expat, which had its own barriers, those cross collaborations are so essential. So one door might be pretty shut and locked, but the other door might not be. Those cross collaborations from private to governmental, schools, every organization possible. And it did start with awareness. awareness normalize. There are indeed individuals who are neurodiverse, and that is okay. And that wasn't technically a term 13 years ago, but it's okay. There's help available. The goal when I came to Cayman was to minimize how many individuals had to leave, because we've already discussed the stressors around that. And through collaboration, through successful partnerships, there is now, I'm training people in governmental agencies. They've seen efficacy, so it only takes a few pilots, to be fair, at least in Cayman, to a few free offerings to see an outcome that can then be justified to government for additional funding or to private funding sources. Years of trying to get this to where it is now. There's a BCBA in the government school system now, and that's a huge win. They're hiring RBTs from the private providers. They're acknowledging a fact that hiring unskilled people to support individuals
That's awesome.
in their school system is completely inappropriate. And that one-off trainings, professional development day, do not work. And so over time, there's really been a significant amount of learning that's taken place, but it's taken place very slowly. And so, as Gabi said, that long-term strategic plan, now to be fair, and I'm going to be like full disclosure, it wasn't necessarily in my mind. It's like, this is my 2-year plan and my 4-year plan and my 8-year plan. But I was doing the therapy at that point. So I wasn't even able to, spend the time to think about that. But thankfully the director here is wonderful at helping with those connections to allow, that thought process to take place as well, and those partnerships as well. But more of the story from that joint collaborative presentation was that you start small, you find your one door, like Gabi said, you acknowledge the past, you respect it, you don't shove it under the rug, and you help improve awareness, acceptability of both providing services as well as receiving them. Who's providing the services as well as who's receiving them. And not everyone's going to be off and running as quickly because funding really is important. But regulatory bodies start to improve themselves. Licensing boards start to be established. There's a National Council for Disabilities here now. I'm now on the steering committee for the Adult Safeguarding Committee. So legislation is changing, and I don't know which started first. Awareness of special needs, and then therefore action, some action, more awareness. It's the chicken and the door might be different, but if you remain solution focused and refuse to take no for an answer, then you can start to make waves, right? Gabi and I, through the Caribbean Association for Behaviour Analysis, are, diverting left, right, and center until we figure it out, along with our other board members. And Gabi, tell me if I'm wrong, but I think we're over 70 now.
Yes, we're right at 70
members from across the Caribbean.
Islands represented. Yeah. So.
Mm-hmm. And every island has its own story. So I know we're kind of representing just 3, but I've heard from parents of various islands that, they're doing things their own way, and that's okay. And there's no right way to do it. The Caribbean is so diverse, like Gabi and Kimberly have said, and the histories that have resulted in this diversity, and what overseas country or they has resulted in where they are now, and I respect that. But I also think that there's an impetus for change, and there always will be.
Yeah, I will. One thing that I was thinking about as Sloane was talking is something I've had various people go like, I want to work with you in the Caribbean. And if you were listening to what Sloane said, and if I think about my work, like it's that, you're working to get paid in some ways, and then you're doing a lot of joining boards and attending meetings. And there's a lot of just free work that goes in there, right? And just, yeah, it sounds, I think, because you think like Caribbean, nice touristy tropical island, great. And then if you actually think about the work, it's rolling up your sleeves and doing a lot of stuff. Like I joke with my team in Curacao, I go, as long as I get like the 4 to 6 p.m. time off whenever I'm there, so I can go to the beach with my kids, But in reality, like if I ever get a call from some minister that says, you want to meet at 5:00 and talk about this? Yeah, I'm there. Like, right. Like whoever I need to talk to, whoever I need to collaborate with, keeping an open mind to whatever other services are there and not isolating people. It's a very experience, connection, and just, learning to collaborate and learning to listen and recognizing. You made me the expert at behavior analysis, but there is so much to learn. Even on my own island, I have to sit down and actually listen. And when we were working with the schools, they said, "What are you going to say?" I said, "I'm not going to say much. I just want to hear what they're thinking before I put my opinion in there, because I need to understand what's happening."
I totally agree. I think
I have to agree with you as well. And I wasn't coming from the place that there are so many barriers that it's impossible to deliver services. It's just that I think in order to understand the population you're dealing with, you need to understand their history, their learning history, their cultural identity. Again, behavior analysis is, effective and it makes change and it does wonderful things and it's a science. But I do think that there is a component that is missing, but maybe it's being built and worked on now, that you do have to understand people's learning histories, where they're coming from, and again, coming a place of where you're listening and learning from them, and again, being able to overcome obstacles, but also, again, to meet people where they really are and to get that parent buy-in as well. You really have to be able to understand one's identity. Maybe it's even a microcosm of culture. It doesn't occur in a vacuum, right? It doesn't occur in an isolated vacuum. It is something that is multifaceted. And when you're dealing with many people, whether it's in Jamaica, whether it's in Trinidad, whether it's in Turks and Caicos, you have to be able to understand where they're coming from and to learn from, mistakes in the past and how to move forward and how to be determined. So my goal is not to just shed the barriers, but I think to understand the barriers and our learning history. It helps us understand what shapes us as people know. And then when we meet these parents and these families, then you can understand where they're coming from, so you can effectively provide services. So that's just my 2 cents. That the main point I want to drive home is that it doesn't occur in a vacuum, and so private health ministers, education that you'll need to jump through hoops for. I mean, we do have the Jamaica Autism Support Association, which I believe was founded in 2007. There's also the Maya Chung Autism and Disabilities Foundation as well. They do wonderful, wonderful work. But again, I think it's very important that in order to ethically serve someone, you have to be able to take it from a cultural lens and do some self-reflection and come in, again, with lots of cultural humility as well. Because I think that's the only way that you'll make effective change with multiple population. This doesn't only apply to the Caribbean, it applies across the board. So
I think there's been proven research that shows like trauma is intergenerational, right? And so it's not just the trauma, but just like you said, learning histories. And there's so many multifaceted components that go into the delivery of our services, and us acknowledging and trying to take these things into account is a job in and of itself, right? However, I also feel that is very similar to, the history of ABA, in that where it started and where it's come to, which thankfully has come to a very progressive, much more ethical, humane place. When it started, every science journey. But I do see some, parallels between taking into account the learnings, acknowledging them. You can't undo them, right? And keeping them at the forefront of your mind while you're trying to not only serve the population, for more services, disseminate information in the appropriate way to the consumers. I think all of those things, a BCBA is not just someone who supervises an RBT or an IBT or an ABAT or whomever. There's so much more to that, and I think that occurs in the US in different ways, but in the Caribbean, I think it's a job.
I think you're so right, because I was just thinking, I started working in the US 20 years ago, where there wasn't insurance funding, all of that. So it was the same kind of starting new, and maybe it's some of the things that I like is being like helping pave the way. But we're now 20 years later and we're doing it again on our islands, which means we have all this learning, right? We don't have to do it the same way. We can move forward and learn from the past. And I think the Caribbean just, this stuff is applicable anywhere, but because we are such a hodgepodge of cultures and languages, right? So our center, we run in 4 different languages. We have people from different countries, right? We're 35 miles off the coast of South America. So people are coming to us all the time from Colombia and Venezuela as well. So we just, in some places you might be able to do things a certain way because it's all people who are like you, but I think interculture differences are also there, right? But in the Caribbean, it's just such a hodgepodge, such a mix. You can't be anything other than a BCBA who is, or behavior analyst, right? Who is aware of the importance of that humanness, that culture, that community. I just do it. And very quickly I learned this kind of things that it was when we were talking, like you cannot just pick up a program and go,
absolutely,
all right, that worked really well. I'm going to drop it here. It takes social significance and individualization goes to the next level. I mean, one, you're just going to get the doors slammed on you and the family's going to go like, nope, this doesn't work for us. But also as we were starting to run our center, it just didn't work. It didn't work for the way we were set up. It didn't work for funding. It didn't work for the staff. And I had to.
Are you a BCBA supervisor looking to streamline your practice? Or maybe you're working towards your BCBA and need to find the right supervisor. House offers tools that make supervision so much more enjoyable for both supervisor and supervisee. For supervisors, they offer easy meeting documentation, competency tracking, monthly verification forms, a built-in supervision curriculum, and so much more. For supervisees, House has a fieldwork tracker with built-in auditing, monthly verification forms, a curriculum, quizzes, and more. If you're looking for a supervisor, they even have a supervision marketplace where you can connect with BCBAs until you find your perfect match, kind of like professional dating. For more information, go to whomhouse.com/speak or search House on Google. The third secret word is background.
Go, okay, I have all these great ideas, but they're just great ideas if I can't actually implement them in this setting. And so I had to really look at collaboration and take some of my, I had acclimated really good. I can go, okay, this is life in Curacao. What does that look like? Let me go back. And it just really makes you stop and go, okay, we're a field of people working with other people. I go into people's lives, into people's homes, and you cannot just be the scientist or the behavior analyst. You have to be all these other things as well to be successful. And I think we can learn from the practices in the Caribbean that's how we need to be anywhere we go to practice with people. I always say, like, we're people working with other people for other people. It's all about those interactions with other people. And you can't do it in a vacuum.
I think we can go on and on, Ben. You might want to reel us in just a little bit.
So we absolutely can go on, and I imagine we'll have more of these conversations as we go on. This has been a very, very cool discussion, and I'm learning lots and lots and lots about the Caribbean and everything that's kind of going on there. The sort of initial impetus for bringing you folks on back when was a post I saw somewhere about the Caribbean Association for Behavior Analysis. So I was wondering if folks might be able to, maybe we could sort of finish off with a bit about sort of, the history of QABA, how long it's been around, and kind of, and then kind of get into sort of the work you're doing right now, and maybe, if there are sort of behavior analysts in sort of other parts of the Caribbean that maybe aren't aware or don't know about this, or maybe there's behavior analysts that are, used to be in the Caribbean or now in other places that maybe want to connect, that sort of thing. Tell me all about QABA and what you're doing, and sort of, what's the future looking like?
Gabi, you okay if I go first for a second? Okay, so Ben, I think it was the post about how 3 of our board members are presenting at a panel at ABAI in Denver on cultural and what starting services in the Caribbean can teach us. Yeah, so that's 3 of our board members. So Gabi, who's our president-elect, myself, who's the president, and Megan First. She is a member of LAR, so we're participating in a panel. It was an extremely important topic, and it aligned very much with what the mission of QABA is, how we're trying to move and disseminate information forward across the Caribbean, how we're trying to acknowledge what may have happened and aim to improve, the application of the science so that there are more higher quality programs in place. So the Caribbean Association was founded in 2020, and it was the Regulation Advancement Discipline System. We're an affiliated chapter of ABAI, so the Caribbean affiliated chapter. And, our mission is to disseminate the information, support ethical and effective and humane use of behavior analysis, advocate for funding mandates and evidence-based intervention. So we spoke about this a little bit in terms of having to acknowledge things that have happened across the Caribbean, aim to upskill and educate and improve quality. We want to provide opportunities for continuing education at, a reasonable rate. Things that, our membership this year was free. This has been our first really active year, 2022. We want to support the activities of ABAI and promote high standards of credentialing. A lot of the Caribbean, there's not institutes of higher education, that allow for individuals to stay on island to study. And that is a barrier. It's a huge barrier. And we aim to assist with that. Gabi and her company have been wonderful. They are the first in the Caribbean to have a approved content. Sorry, Gabi, I'm giving you a plug here. Approved content provider for the IBA and the IBT, International Behavior Analyst and International Behavior Therapist.
Cool.
And then our company is an approved content provider for the IBT. Through this panel, we're really hoping that the Caribbean services and how to improve outcomes and quality becomes something that's a bit more at the forefront, as it really hasn't been thus far. And so that was really one of the big impetuses behind us aiming to present that topic on the panel. And it's really exciting that it's 3 members of our board that really speaks to our dedication for that value-based care and compassionate care, which is essential, which might not have been individuals' first experience with ABA in the Caribbean, if I'm being 100% honest. Gabi?
Yeah, and I think the other thing is that we talked about, right, like a large country can work internally on their own and maybe get regulations set in place, right? I think 2020 was right when the BACB announced, right, that it was only going to be US and right, Canada, UK, Australia. And so for me, for example, I was looking at using the BCBA, right? Those credentials as like a tool to go, look, there's a legitimate career path. You have to get training. And then that was kind of, that ended. And so the guidance we were given was like, look at what you can do within your country, where when you're a country of 60,000 people, a country of 150,000 people, it's really small, right? And you're going to have small numbers. And so getting regulatory bodies set up, getting systems set up, like larger system changes happening when you're a small country is always going to be harder because your resources are limited, but also just your numbers will be smaller. If it's, I'm just pulling it at any other large, like if it's Australia, I actually know from reading an article, they also have lower numbers, but as a population based, you'll eventually be able to this legislation. And so knowing that we were small, we started talking amongst ourselves and going, okay, what can we do? And we recognized that there was very little representation of people from the Caribbean, and there wasn't a chapter, there wasn't anything that represented us. So even on the IBAO's professional advisory board, we were looking, and there was no one from the Caribbean. And so we really started thinking of ways like, what do we need to do as a region to make sure that our voices are heard, right? Like Kimberly right now going out and doing presentations, Caribbean person, I'm going, yes, someone else from the Caribbean, getting research out there, getting information out there that's more relevant to who we are, who our cultures are. Even though we've spoken about all these differences, we have a lot in common. The Caribbean Association, getting QABA together is really this place to say, let's band together and strengthen numbers, even though we have a lot of differences to figure out. We're going to support each other because we really do understand a little bit more about what it's like to be a Caribbean nation, what it's like to be a Caribbean colonized nation, right? To be small, to have limited resources in some ways. And so that getting together was really what got us moving. And so our core, we're founded on the Cayman Islands, but we have myself, daily, our goal is to get more to other islands so that we can all learn from each other and also learn how we can support each other. So CEUs that are more relevant to practicing in the Caribbean. And right, like Sloane was saying, what I've dedicated myself to is these trainings, this IBT training and this IBA course that are giving knowledge about, right, everything about ABA that I know, but then also how you do apply it with that culturally compassionate, culture responsive lens so that it applies to Caribbean. I actually have people from many different countries in the course now, so it's going to be this amazing learning experience, I think, for me, on how to shape, as we're going, the course in a way that it's not just like, here's all this ABA knowledge, but it's also like, what does it look like in your country, on your island? And how can you, in an ethical way, in an evidence-based way, in a culturally responsive way, use these amazing principles of the science that we all know and love and make it truly valuable.
Yeah, there's 15. So at the end of 2022, there are 15 countries.
That's my mission with
Caribbean,
my organization now. I live in the US. I work mostly outside the US at this point.
Countries.
Just connecting people on different islands. And it's hard when you feel like you're the only one doing it. And then when you recognize
we're excited.
You might be the only one on your island, but on Turks and Caicos, someone is doing it as well. Right.
Draw the line.
In Trinidad, there's someone doing it as well. Then you create a community that you can lean on each other for. And at least you have that community, even if your challenges are different, you have a group of people you can turn to. So we've done some great stuff, like foundational stuff, getting ourselves really up and running, and really looking forward to continuing to just build these opportunities to be connected across the Caribbean, and then also providing resources
and republics,
training
but
opportunities.
As Gabi links there that might be expanding the number, expand the numbers. So it's really is, where do you draw the line?
That's a great question. I'd have to Google it.
I was gonna say that is a great question, because like we have actually people from Central America too. So sometimes like Belize and Costa Rica, who are Central.
Correct. Yeah. So it's
American, but they have a coast on the Caribbean. They get counted sometimes, and then other times it's just the islands. So
exactly. Yeah. So
yes, because I think about like Martinique and Guadeloupe.
In the geographical region,
there's not their own countries, right? They're just part of France.
Exactly.
So if you were to count them, you don't count them as a country, but they are certainly islands that should not be disregarded when we're trying to reach out to people. So I would say there's probably, in terms of like regions or
I think it might be 28. I'm not, again, it depends, because even when you're learning like geography and history in prep school, we learn about like the Lesser Antilles and the Greater Antilles. So if you're on the western side, then you're part of the Greater Antilles, but like Gabi would be part of like the Lesser Antilles. So you do learn all of these things like the elementary stage. So it depends on how you rank it. It depends on if you're counting Latin America as well. So if you count Latin America and the Caribbean, I think it's 33 countries. If you count just like countries that are part of CARICOM, it might be like 13. So it really depends. It's kind of a, I guess, if I'm not mistaken, I think it's 26. But some of them, as Sloane said, they're Sloane and Gabi said, they're not independent. They're either territories or our provinces, or so it
Yeah.
Exactly.
And then you have like St.
Right.
Martin, that is actually a tiny island, but it's two countries because it has a Dutch side and a French side. And so, right. And then some islands like Trinidad and Tobago are two different islands, but they are one country. So
right. And even though Haiti and the DR, the Dominican Republic, it's the same landmass, but they're two different countries as well. So it can get, there's St. Kitts and Nevis too. So it really depends. And then you have like Antigua and Barbuda. And so it really depends.
Not an
So
easy
people
answer,
call like
Ben,
Trinidad and
in other
Tobago the
words.
same place, but they're literally two different landmasses. So it can be, no.
Of
Well,
course.
that's okay. I think maybe that was just curious more, but I think the better question, or maybe I'm gonna maybe even assume here, wherever the highest number is, and if we include all the coastal folks, I presume all these folks are welcome to join.
absolutely. Yes. And anyone who, I mean, we have members like myself who live in, right? We live in another country, but I don't know. I think you leave the islands. Maybe someone will call me wrong, but I don't think you ever really leave your island. Right? There's always a little piece of you. And so if you are living anywhere outside of the Caribbean, but you are connected to laws and are doing back home, if that's back home for you, please join us. We also have members who have joined who are not directly linked to the Caribbean, but they want to support or they want to learn about ways to support. So yes, anyone who lives in the Caribbean, definitely. And it's behavior analysts, but also anyone who's training or working on that RBT or IBT role, any parents, anyone, right? We are really, really wanting to collaborate. So speech therapists, occupational therapists, whatever other field you're in, if you're interested in behavior analysis and behavior analysis specifically in the Caribbean, join us. And we're hoping to offer different levels, right? So Sloane's been working on like a parents corner where we're really working on listening to parents and sharing resources and information specifically for parents. And then Meg and I have focused a little bit more on kind of the continuing education for professionals and get a whole range of things. So lots of different resources.
And I love that you added that part that, sorry, we're all talking. I said, I love that you have extended that to people who may want to help and they may not be from the Caribbean, but maybe again, they are second generation and they have that ancestry and that heritage and they want to, they want to help, or they just need continuing education opportunities as well. That would be amazing. I think it's a great thing that you've created our own little, area in behavior analysis, because you're right, there was no representation. And how would people reach out to QABA or the Caribbean?
Yes, that was my next question. Thank you, Kimberly.
Well, you can go through our website. So it's www.caribbeanba.org, and you can join as a member that way.
And on there, we have links to, we have a LinkedIn page, a Instagram, Facebook. So any of those. And all that is on our website.
You can also email ba.org if you want a more specific, have a more specific question as to whether you'd be able to be a member or whether you want to contribute, etc.
Perfect. So this was an awesome conversation, and for folks that are going to be listening to this episode, it's going to require a little more editing than maybe some of the normal ones, due to a lot of the delays in voices and different sort of internet connections. And so first off, I just want to thank everybody for having the patience to sort of sit through this. Folks won't hear this in the audio, but there was there was lots of fuzzy robotic voices and people talking over each other and not knowing it, and lots of sort of delays waiting for sort of the little yellow square over the name to sort of stop highlighting so the next person could talk. And so I know this conversation took a little more mental effort than maybe your normal chat. And so I just really appreciate everybody sticking through it, not quitting, and do know that both for you three, this will sound much better than it did for us. And for the folks listening, just know that we have a lot of dedicated, passionate folks here that really kind of plowed through our internet bandwidth issues. I want to thank all three of you for coming on the podcast. I'm going to be sharing, obviously, everything you folks talked about in terms of links and organizations and contacts and websites and all those things in the show notes. So folks will have lots and lots of sort of resources if they want to start learning more about ABA in the Caribbean and providing services for autistic folks and so on and so forth in these areas. And certainly if there's lots of folks, I'm sure there's lots of folks listening that may just have a connection to the Caribbean. In fact, I have a BCBA supervisee right now that his family is actually from Barbados. So I'm actually looking forward to my next supervision session with him, because I'll have a lot more things to talk about and a lot of questions to ask him about sort of his experiences, and maybe suggest that he might even want to join. So thanks again to the three of you for coming on, and hopefully folks check you out at ABAI, and hopefully folks check out the website and join up or just connect with you folks to learn more. And I hope we can have an updated conversation down the road.
And thank you so much for having us. Yeah, it's been a really insightful conversation. Yes, and kudos to you, Ben, for having this space for people to talk. I love that you have such a wide variety of speakers coming in and topics. So I really think it's amazing what you're doing with the Behaviour Speak podcast too. It's great work.
Thank you so much. That would be wonderful.
Having us, and please do connect with us. And yeah, we're going to keep working. So we're happy to keep talking about the work we're doing in our different areas. So